Welcome back to Silicon Bytes on a day which is full of drama, but which contains events which actually many of my guests and indeed myself have been predicting for some time. Escalating challenges to NATO and the Western alliance that is supporting Ukraine against Russia. Let's jump into the episode in a minute. First, thank you so much to everyone who supports the channel through Buy Me a Coffee, Patreon, and of course, if you like, subscribe and add comments to videos. It is tremendously helpful. Tomorrow, we have a special guest on the channel to talk about the incursions, the triggering of Article 4. It will be Keir Giles, perhaps the person best placed in the world to speak about this, and again, someone who's been predicting just such a provocation for several years now, in fact. Let's jump in to the story. Poland has triggered NATO Article 4 in what is being interpreted by informed commentators as a significant sub-threshold escalation by Russia and an explicit threat to Europe and the NATO alliance, as well as marking the war's widening arc and impact. Poland says a mass of Russian drone-type objects broke into its airspace as Moscow hammered Ukraine. Polish and Allied jets, including Dutch F-35s, scrambled and shot several down. Warsaw shut airports, ordered people indoors, and did something only anticipated in the gravest moments. It invoked Article 4 of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Last night, the Polish airspace was violated by a huge number of Russian drones. Those drones that posed a direct threat were shot down, said Prime Minister Donald Tusk. Associated Press reported this today. The EU's top diplomat, Kaja Kallas, called it the most serious European airspace violation by Russia since the war began, adding that indications suggest it was intentional, not accidental. Again, reporting by Reuters and ABC News. And this is no isolated scare. It fits a pattern. Missiles and drones straying into NATO skies, GPS jamming from Kaliningrad, and the return of Sept, Russia's most confrontational military drills, run with Belarus. Tonight we map the pattern, the risks, and what comes next. We use extensive sources such as AP News, Defence News, and Chatham House. And while I was writing the script for this, of course, more news is flooding in. We now have some extraordinary reporting of comments by Donald Trump. He wrote on Truth Social, "What's with Russia violating Poland's airspace with drones? Here we go." A lot of people are wondering what that actually means. I tend to interpret "here we go" as perhaps he had some foreknowledge that something like this was going to happen. Perhaps he knows what's going to happen next. Well, we will potentially find that out. Also quoting from social media, this time it is from X, or formerly Twitter. Dave Hale, a concerned Republican, writes, J.D. Vance says the administration sees no reason to continue to economically isolate Russia. That is just hours after Russian drones violated Polish airspace en masse. Dave Hale writes, either he is a useful idiot for the Kremlin or worse. I think the needle is pointing towards worse, far worse at this point. The question we must ask, though, if the incursions into Poland were intentional by Putin's fascistic regime, then it would be accompanied by a disinformation operation as well. These would appear structured, coordinated, and would have a clear narrative thread. And such a story is emerging, one that needs to be thoroughly investigated. Such narratives typically have strategic purpose to them, to divide an adversary, to weaponize the internal politics of that adversary, or to try and drive a wedge between allies. The emerging narrative that has clear traces of strategic purpose too. There appears to be an active push around the idea that the Shahed 136 drones that entered Poland were under the influence of Ukrainian electronic warfare, that is EW. We saw a plethora of distracting narratives emerge after the downing of MH17, and a similar pattern is emerging here, although it is only the first few hours, of course, of this news breaking. At the core of the disinformation narrative that is being actively promoted by Russian platforms is the story that Ukraine is to blame for the incident. Russia can't deny that the drones are of their own manufacture and came from a direction which clearly indicated they were launched by Russia, but they may be counting on widespread ignorance of how EW works in practice. Russia has also been building extensive connections into Poland's information space to undermine support for Ukraine within Poland, despite the massive boost to Poland's economy that's been provided by displaced Ukrainians and the fact the absolute vast majority, are extremely peaceful and hard-working. These divisive Russian narratives have unfortunately gained some traction. Support for Ukraine and its moral struggle to defend itself against genocidal invasion, against erasure, in fact, has collapsed in Poland under the weight of disinformation efforts and the conscious choice by some Polish politicians and conservative nationalist figures to weaponize historical memory. Currently, the worst possible timing to do that right now, which has eroded support for Ukraine. There is an allegation that Russia may be behind the push of messaging using the Polish language and Polish social media accounts that electronic warfare managed by Ukrainians was to blame for the drones entering Poland. Let's unpack why this is absurd on so many levels to ensure absolute clarity. Ukraine does use electronic warfare to suppress Shahed 136 drones, but in these cases, the drone loses control and flies straight. That means that if it's come under EW or electronic warfare, it can't change its flight path. It can't make maneuvers or adjustments to a different altitude. That's because it's getting no instructions from its handler. In this circumstance, it would fly until it runs out of fuel and crashes or is shot down. Alternative scenarios are that it can leave the zone of signal suppression created by EW and it can resume its original course, or else it catches a satellite signal and returns to the target. All the drones that entered Polish airspace were constantly maneuvering and did not try to return to Ukraine. In other words, their course of flight was initially coded to targets within Polish territory. The types of EW utilized by Ukrainian forces for suppressing Shahed 136 simply cannot operate at a distance of 50 kilometers. And the drones were well outside that range by the time they were shot down in Polish airspace or fell out of the sky. It is also rumoured, but not confirmed, that there were many more drones than the 19 that were eventually reported by the Polish government, heading along the same trajectory, but some were destroyed by Ukrainian air defence and some may have dropped down while still on Ukrainian territory. Watch out for the narrative from Russia that they had no intention of hitting Poland. These weren't their drones anyway. Useful idiots, ministers in places like Hungary and Slovakia are already spouting this kind of nonsense. They will also be saying that this is actually a provocation by Ukraine. That in fact, yes, maybe they look like Russian drones, but they were launched by Ukraine after all. Expect this kind of nonsense in the coming hours and days. But the Russian strategic intent is clear. On this channel, we've been predicting for the last year that Russia would escalate towards an Article 5 challenge to NATO. And in the last weeks, we've seen an exact pattern of escalation that leads to this drone incursion. It is not the last step either in this escalatory ladder, in a planned chain of escalatory steps. Putin will be gauging the response of the West. It does not help that for several hours today, Poland was reporting 19 drones and NATO only 8. Whatever the reasons, Russia will interpret this as an attempt to minimize the attack and as a clear sign of weakness and potentially division. It is obvious Russia is trying to achieve several aims with this provocation. The first is to test NATO's resilience. The second is to strike targets on the territory of one of the alliance countries for the first time in more than half a century and very close to a key logistics hub that delivers supplies to Ukraine. The third goal is to sow discord between Ukraine and Poland. The last point here to note, if the drones were intended for Ukrainian targets, then most would have been packed with explosives. It appears that the drones that breached Polish airspace may not have been. So what happened over Poland? What do we know so far? Well, let's start with what has been reported to date. Poland's military tracked well over a dozen inbound drones over several hours. 19 intrusions is the working figure in multiple briefings, with at least 3 downed and a 4th likely destroyed before dawn. Airports, including Warsaw's Chopin, were temporarily closed. Debris turned up across eastern Poland and as far west as the Lodz region. One home was seriously damaged. This is reported, of course, in multiple outlets, but especially Reuters and The Guardian is the coverage we call on here. The drones arrived amid one of Russia's broadest overnight strikes in months on Ukraine itself. Roughly 415 Shahed-type drones and 40-plus missiles launched across 15 Ukrainian regions. Ukraine says it intercepted the majority, but some strayed west, and some didn't just stray, they crossed into Polish territory, we believe quite deliberately. This hints at the idea that there may have been many more programmed to continue through Ukraine and pass into Poland, but were shot down en route by Ukraine. Politically, Warsaw moved fast. Tusk briefed allies, opened debris recovery sites, and triggered Article 4 consultations, the clause for urgent NATO talks when a member's security or territorial integrity is threatened. Article 4 is not a war or a request for allies to come to the military defence of a partner. Rather, it is sounding the alarm of a threat. That's from AP Explainer and the Washington Post. Allies across capitals, phones lit up. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer called Russia's violation extremely reckless. EU leaders floated additional sanctions, and the discussion widened to reinforcing eastern flank air defences and even a drone wall across the border. That's reported in Reuters. And another detail matters, the origin and the intent. Polish and Ukrainian officials said some drones came via Belarus. That's where the Sept 2025 aggressive military drills are spinning up at the moment. More on that later, but let's flag this now. The timing is not subtle, and nor is it coincidental. So was the attack intentional? The indicators are yes, and why that matters. Well, Moscow denies it targeted Poland. Of course it would, as ever, demands proof from the victim. But European officials aren't buying the shrug emoji response anymore. What are the indicators that this was a Russian attack? Well, the first is scale and persistence. We're not talking about a single lost munition that wandered off course. This was a mass strike. 19 airspace breaches over several hours with multiple waypoints inside Poland and one house hit by the debris. That pattern is hard to chalk up to drift or error. And if it's true that many more such projectiles were heading towards Poland but were intercepted en route, then the attack would have been even larger. Secondly, vectors via Belarus. That is the same Belarus hosting Sept 2025 and with the Suwalki corridor next door, NATO's narrowest and most vulnerable point. Exercises are prime cover for an oops moment, such as the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, but they can be cover for a multitude of malicious acts. This reporting comes from Reuters and Chatham House. 3. Escalatory messaging. Ukraine's president said at least 8 drones were aimed towards Poland during the strike. That, of course, has gone up now to 19. And Poland's PM told Parliament that this is the closest we have been to open conflict since World War II, while stressing that no one wants to slide into such a conflict. In other words, Russia is probing, not blundering. Probing the responses of NATO allies, of the US, probing the military response, Poland's air defense reflexes, as well as political reflexes. Ultimately, they may be probing to see how many drones it takes for NATO to treat this as a direct confrontation, a red line breach, rather than dismissing it with non-committal label of grey zone incursion, the diplomatic equivalent of thoughts and prayers. Poland's shootdown is a first for this war, but Russia and war-related unscrewed systems have pushed into non-competent airspace since 2022. In Croatia, a downed drone was reported near Zagreb. In Romania, repeated Shahid debris and fragments have been found. And in Moldova, decoy drones crashed deep inside their territory. NATO often assessed there to be no intentional attack on these occasions, but the frequency and depth of violations keeps ticking upwards. Poland itself has been here before, if on a smaller scale. In March 2024, Warsaw said that a Russian cruise missile pierced its airspace for nearly 40 seconds. There was no NATO engagement at that point. Stern notes were exchanged, letters were written, etc., and the pattern inched onwards. Western weakness of response was noted, of course, by Russia. Now contrast that restraint with Turkey in 2015 when a Russian Su-24 violated Turkish airspace near Syria after 10 warnings. Ankara fired and shot the plane down. Vladimir Putin blasted the shootdown as a stab in the back administered by the accomplices of terrorists. That was Reuters reporting November 24th, 2015. But the reality is that this caused barely a ripple in relations between Moscow and Turkey, yet it demonstrated the willingness of Turkey to defend its airspace and its interests robustly. And guess what? Russia hasn't tested those limits again up to the present time. So what's the lesson to take from Turkey? Well, deterrence erodes if you never say stop and you never back anything up with action. For years, NATO avoided kinetic engagement with stray drones to head off any kind of escalation with Moscow, and Moscow read the caution and has just tested it now in a maximal way, a way that it is impossible to ignore. But if we do underplay it, we'll have shown an entirely self-destructive level of weakness towards the Kremlin. Let's turn to another threat that's been ongoing for the entirety, I think, of the full-scale war, and that is the grey zone escalator, the jamming, spoofing, and sub-threshold hits in the Baltics. Even before last night, Russia's hybrid toolkit was buzzing. GNSS jamming and spoofing have rippled across the Baltic and Black Sea regions since 2022, spiking this year. Civilian flights diverted or landings aborted, ships lost accurate fixes, and even just last week, Ursula von der Leyen's plane reportedly suffered a GPS failure on its approach to Plovdiv, prompting NATO to say it's actively countering Russian interference. That's reported in AP and Reuters. Researchers have traced powerful jamming to the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad. The Baltic Nordic regulators have logged thousands of cases. One estimate says that nearly 123,000 flights over the Baltic were impacted in the first 4 months of 2025 alone. That's not accidental interference. That's a policy of interference on a simply industrial scale. Well, you can find more on that in Defence News, July 2nd, 2025. Bundle that with airspace probes, energy sabotage risks, and cyber ops, and you get a layered strategy. Push everywhere just below the tripwire, which is why last night's kinetic response matters. This is clearly Russia stomping on the tripwire and daring us with a big "so what" shrug. The grey zone has edges, but will these be acknowledged by Europe and by NATO? While Poland was under drone fire, Kiev was also under fire this week, but of a far more aggressive kind. On September 7th, Russia launched its largest air attack of the war, unleashing 800 plus drones and missiles that set Ukraine's main government building ablaze. This is the first time that a national seat of the administration was struck. Those strikes also killed a mother and her infant in their home. If you haven't seen the images of that, they are utterly tragic. This is reported in more detail in Reuters and The Guardian. President Zelensky called the damage and the killings a deliberate crime and a prolongation of the war. That's according to ABC News. And yesterday, the massacre of pensioners and postal workers queuing up to receive pensions in a Ukrainian village is a blatant war crime on a terrifying scale. Once again, the Kremlin is mocking diplomacy, trampling international law, and killing indiscriminately, wrote Ursula von der Leyen. Kaja Kallas added, every Russian attack is a deliberate choice and a message Russia does not want peace, reported in the Kiev Independent, 7th of September. The modus operandi is familiar now and quite deliberate. Saturate air defences with Shaheeds, then follow with missiles and pepper the attack with decoys to deplete air defence systems. Ukraine intercepts most, sometimes hundreds in a single night, but most still leaves quite a lot to get through. The incursion of drones into Poland didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened while Kiev was burning. The moral geometry here is straightforward. If you tolerate mass terror next door, then the shrapnel eventually lands on your front porch. Zapad 2025 and the road after Article 4. Enter Zapad 2025, Russia and Belarus's flagship war game, whose name literally means West. Analysts warn the official headcount always lowballs the reality. In 2021, claims of 13,000 troops masked regional deployments of 200,000 as a prelude to the invasion of Ukraine. This year's drill again tests strike coordination, jamming, drones, and logistics. And yes, it also tests the nerves of the Western allies as well. That's reported in SIPA and Defence News in early September. Chatham House argues the exercise also signals Minsk's role and tests Western thresholds. Poland is already closing the Belarus border for the duration of the drills. That is sensible, as is the act of shooting down Russian drones, as is the declaration of Article 4. So what should Article 4 deliver, and what are the implications? Initial promises suggest air defence layering on the eastern flank, more mobile short-range systems in forward positions, shared radar tracks, faster weapons release authorities in cross-border intercepts. That's from AP Explainer, Reuters, Q and A. Finally, don't miss the political signal. Tusk told Parliament this is the closest we've been to open conflict since World War II, then added an important second sentence. There is no reason to believe we're on the brink of war. I'm not sure he told that to Moscow, though. Moscow understands that sub-threshold doesn't mean risk-free. In fact, they are committed to raising the risk and raising the stakes. Will Europe fold every time, though? Russia keeps claiming accidents while laying out patterns of escalation and provocation, probing and testing. The pattern is airspace violations, GPS blackout, strikes against Western assets in Ukraine, and now drone incursions synchronized with hostile war games next door. It is a series of calculated escalatory steps. Poland's response didn't escalate. So far, it has recalibrated, but without being overly weak, which is good. It told the Kremlin that NATO's eastern sky is not a laboratory for experiments in aggression. It also told allies that the time for serious deterrence has come. If we don't heed the call, then it will invite the next stage of aggression from Moscow, and that will be far harder to ignore.